There may come a time after awakening when life still looks the same on the outside, but no longer feels the same from within. You may wake up in the same room, speak to the same people, go through the same responsibilities, and yet, somewhere behind all of it, something has shifted. The old explanations no longer reach as deeply as they once did. The old identity no longer feels completely solid. The old way of moving through life still functions, but it no longer feels like the whole truth. At first, this can feel like freedom. Then, unexpectedly, it can feel like emptiness. The first brightness fades. The first sense of liberation becomes quiet. And what remains is not yet clarity, not yet peace, not yet a new way of being fully formed. It is a vast, undefined space. A space where the old self no longer feels completely real, but something deeper has not yet become livable. This is the strange silence after the first threshold of awakening. And for many, it can feel like being suspended between two worlds. After the struggle, the contradiction, and the restless movement inside that open space, there comes a point when consciousness begins to recognize more clearly where it truly is in the journey. The vast emptiness is no longer only a place of uncertainty. It is no longer only the discomfort that appears when the early joy has faded and the next direction has not yet become visible. Slowly, it begins to reveal itself as a natural stage, not a mistake, not a failure, not proof that awakening was false. It is the open space that appears after the first door has been crossed. And then, very quietly, something begins to change. Not as a sudden moment of light, not as another peak experience. Something more subtle begins underneath the struggle. A kind of understanding starts to form, not through thinking, not through force, not because the mind has finally solved the problem. It is more like an understanding that was already spacious enough to hold the entire problem, waiting beneath the noise, waiting for the struggle to lose some of its speed. And when that happens even slightly, the warmth of that understanding can begin to be felt. This understanding does not reject what came before. It understands the awakening itself, the power of it, the truth of it, the way it broke through the old frame of perception. It also understands what happened afterward. The mind tried to hold on. It tried to rebuild. It tried to make a new ground out of an experience that had revealed groundlessness. It tried to turn openness into something it could possess, explain, repeat, or use as a new identity. And all the regret, doubt, resistance, heaviness, and confusion that followed can now be seen differently. They were not simply failures. They were the survival movements of a mind standing before something it had never learned how to live with. When this is truly seen, the harshness begins to soften, not because anything has been forced to change, but because the whole movement is finally being understood. From this understanding, something warmer begins to appear. Compassion. Not compassion as a technique, not compassion as a spiritual instruction placed on top of discomfort, not the kind of forced kindness that still hides a subtle rejection underneath. This compassion is different. It is the natural warmth of understanding. Like when light becomes clear enough, the darkness no longer has to be attacked. Because it is understood, it is embraced. There is compassion for the self, for the mind, for the contradictions, for the struggle, for the desperate attempt to rebuild what had already begun to dissolve. This love is not manufactured. It is not something a separate person gives to themselves as comfort. It appears on its own when awareness becomes wide enough to include everything that is present. The confusion, the resistance, the longing to escape, the longing to go back, the part that wants the journey to be over, the part that still wants to be someone who has awakened. All of it is held inside a larger field of understanding. And in that field, things do not need to be pushed away in order to become lighter. Within this space, another recognition begins to become clear, not as an idea to remember, not as a belief to repeat, but as something that can be lived. There is not truly a separate me performing everything that is happening. And yet this does not mean the sense of me has to be denied. It is more subtle than denial. The me is also part of the unfolding. The self is not standing outside the journey, controlling it from a separate place. It is an expression inside the journey itself. Consciousness is unfolding. Life is unfolding. And what we call I is one movement within that unfolding, not the owner of it. This recognition does not create passivity. It does not make life careless. It does not mean nothing matters. It simply removes a certain burden. The burden of having to be the one who completes transformation. The burden of having to recognize the right thing, release the right thing, reach the right state, become the right version of awareness. Something relaxes. The journey does not stop. But the imagined controller is no longer carrying the whole weight of it. Everything is still happening. Only now it is happening inside a movement much larger than the separate self. From here, another kind of awareness begins to open. It is different from what the mind may have first called awakening. At first, awareness can feel like standing in a pure place inside yourself and observing everything else from a distance. Thoughts appear, emotions appear. The body moves, the world continues. And there is a sense of being the untouched witness. This can bring relief. It can feel clean, spacious, and free. But even this kind of witnessing can still contain a subtle division. There is the true knower over here. There are the unreal movements over there. There is awareness, and there is everything awareness observes. That separation may feel peaceful for a while, but it cannot fully remain because it is still a distance. It is still a refined form of standing apart. The awareness born from understanding has a different quality. It does not create distance. It creates reverence. A reverence for this stage. A reverence for the whole journey. A reverence for the simple presence of whatever is here. This awareness is not trying to control experience. It is not trying to keep itself safe from life. Because when something is truly understood, there is no longer the same need to protect oneself from it. Awareness becomes less like a position and more like a living openness. From this openness, the movements that once felt overwhelming begin to be seen more clearly. Some movements look backward. They regret what was missed. They judge the path that has already been walked. They wonder whether the awakening was ever real. Some movements gather around the present, the unresolved tensions, the contradictions of ordinary life, the sense of distance, meaninglessness, or inner emptiness that still appears. And some movements rush toward the future. They want to escape this space. They want a new method, a higher experience, a clearer realization, or they want to return completely to the old life and call everything that happened an illusion. All three movements are natural. They are what the mind does when it stands in the open and does not yet know how to rest there. But when they are seen clearly, without being fed, without being turned into another problem, without being used to build another identity, they begin to dissolve where they appear. Not because someone has defeated them, but because nothing extra is being added. And when nothing extra is added, many things naturally lose their force. Carl Jung once wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." And this is exactly what begins to become visible here. The mind starts to see what it did with the original awakening experience. At the moment of awakening, it may have seemed as if the mind had disappeared, and in a very real sense it had. There was a moment when the usual structure was no longer operating in the same way, but then the mind was still there again. Life continued. The self-sense continued. The old pattern, though weakened or changed, had not ended completely. This is the paradox. The mind seemed to be gone, and yet it remained. It is like wearing dark glasses for so long that the whole world appears through them. Then suddenly, for a moment, the glasses are not there. There is nakedness, there is openness, there is an undeniable seeing. But soon another pair of glasses is being worn. Maybe the color is softer. Maybe the world now looks warmer, lighter, more spacious. But there is still the act of wearing glasses. The color has changed. But the deeper mechanism of seeing through something has not fully revealed itself. What is discovered now is not only the color of the lens, it is the very act of wearing a lens. The whole process becomes visible. And this is not seen with blame. It is seen with compassion, because only compassion can allow the process to be exposed without turning it into another enemy. Effort may try to destroy the mind. Judgment may try to shame the mind. Spiritual ambition may try to transcend the mind. But compassion allows the movement to be seen without resistance. And when the movement is fully seen without resistance, the energy that keeps it hidden begins to release. The mind is not conquered as a spiritual achievement. Rather, the old process is no longer reinforced in the same fog. It is brought into sunlight, and under that sunlight the rough outer ice begins to evaporate. Something may still remain, but it is lighter, more transparent, more subtle, and gradually what is true beneath it becomes easier to recognize. Slowly, the space that once felt unstable, lonely, and directionless begins to reveal another quality, its true quality. It is no longer the emptiness the mind is trying to escape. It is no longer the emptiness the mind is trying to fill. It becomes the space of stillness, not because everything has disappeared, but because everything is being held. The questions, the unfinished parts, the ordinary life, the remnants of the old identity, the movements of fear, longing, confusion, and hope. All of it is held inside something more spacious than any one of those movements. And because it is held, the struggle does not need to be the center anymore. This stillness is not numbness. It is not withdrawal. It is not becoming flat or detached. It is a silence that has room for life. A silence that does not require life to be simpler than it is. Within this stillness, openness begins to return. Not an openness created by decision, not an openness forced through practice, but the openness of a consciousness that no longer needs to stay closed in order to protect itself. There is openness toward the difficulties that are still present in life. Openness toward what has already happened, without needing to judge it or defend it. Openness toward ordinary living, the simple things, relationships, responsibilities, the rhythm of the day, the small gestures that once seemed too ordinary to hold depth. Life becomes available again, but not in the old way. There is a return, but not a collapse back into the old identity. There is participation, but not the same unconscious merging. There is aliveness, but not the same attachment. One can live again without becoming completely lost in the life being lived. One can belong again without shrinking back into the old frame. The space is no longer only a place of loneliness or uncertainty. It becomes a vast foundation. Silent, open, ready. To be with this peaceful space is not proof of a new attainment. It is not a final destination. It is not the flattening of all experience into a vague spiritual calm. It is simply a ground from which everything can be seen more clearly and lived more fully. The past is understood, not because it has been perfected, not because every question has been answered, but because no answer is now required in order to continue. What is here can be lived as it is, not as a lack, not as something that must immediately become different. And what is not yet opened can be received without hurry. The next movement of consciousness, the unknown path ahead, the parts of the journey that cannot yet be imagined, they are met not with excitement and not with fear, but with a quiet readiness, a readiness that does not rush, a readiness that does not demand, a readiness that does not need to know what comes next in order to remain open. And perhaps this is the deeper piece of the space after awakening. Not that the journey is over, but that the journey no longer has to be carried by a separate self trying to complete it. Life continues. Consciousness continues. The unfolding continues. And within it all, there is enough stillness to let everything arrive, change, dissolve, and reveal itself in its own time.